Hello and welcome. My name is Lily Landakusik, and this is Voices of Hope. And today we are focusing on parental alienation prevention with an interview with Dr. William Bernet. And I want to welcome you, Dr. Bernet, and just thank you. We're so grateful that you would be able to take time out for this presentation. You have a wealth of information about your work on the DSM and prevention and helping professionals and parents understand the signs, symptoms, and we're just very honored to have you and want to jump right in.
Thank you very much for inviting me today.
And we'd like to talk today about your work on prevention and then also why having diagnoses in the DSM is so important for prevention. And if you could touch on any areas of adversarial dynamics or designs in the family law system that can kind of lead or encourage alienation or prevent victims of alienation from getting interventions that are helpful, just any areas of prevention that are in need or that we're seeing great gaps that are a direct result or influence to alienation cases.
Sure. So prevention itself is a really important topic, especially in this field of parental alienation. And the reason why it's important is because once parental alienation is in place, and especially if it becomes more severe, it's really very, very difficult to undo it. And it's a whole lot easier and less traumatic for the people involved if alienation can be prevented in the first place, rather than let it progress to more severe degrees of alienation in that family. So there's been a lot of talk about prevention, and there are two or three specific approaches that have been mentioned, which I'm going to summarize here. So the first one is to try to make family court less adversarial. Nowadays, in most states in the United States, when people go to family court, it's one side against the other. One parent wants to blame things on parent A, wants to blame things on parent B, and parent B wants to blame things on parent A. And this can get very, very difficult and acrimonious. So it seems obvious that if it were possible to address the issues of child custody and other things having to do with children in some other way, that would be great. So some places have, in fact, adopted a non-adversarial approach to family court, and that usually involves what's called mandatory mediation, which means that if a case comes to the attention of family court and children are involved, that the parents are required to have mediation by a professional, a person who's trained not just in child custody or divorce, but really understands the things that might happen in alienation. And so in these locations, it's required for people to go to this kind of mediation and hopefully get their issues resolved without fighting it out in court. I'm sure it does not always work, and I'm sure the backup is going to be that they're going to have to go to family court and in fact present their sides to a judge and see what happens. But it would be really great if in most cases it's accomplished by mediation. So that's one aspect of prevention. Another aspect is really tied to not just prevention, but to early intervention. And that has to do with the idea that parental alienation starts out being mild, and then if it progresses, it becomes moderate, and if it progresses further, it becomes severe. And mild cases are much, much easier to intervene with. That you can do certain things, like even the judge could instruct the parents in a certain way, or a psychologist or a social worker could instruct the parents. And the instruction is usually cut out what you're doing. If you're saying things to the child or you're undermining the child's relationship with the other parent, let's stop that. And I want you to understand how harmful that is to the child. And it may be a real burden to the child if you continue to badmouth the other parent or interfere with the other parent's time or with the other parent's relationship. So that kind of message can be given to parents by a court or by a therapist, especially if it's at the very beginning. In other words, if the therapist recognizes that this looks like parental alienation is starting to happen with this case, that's something that a therapist or a judge can do by way of intervention. And of course, that doesn't prevent it altogether, but prevention and early intervention, typically, you think about them together. There's another systemic approach that has been suggested and advocated, which is also likely to reduce the amount of parental alienation. And this is my third topic, and that's shared parenting. That back in the old days, the tradition was that when people go to court, one or the other parent would win, and that parent would get the child for 95% of the time, and the second parent would have the child perhaps every other weekend, or a very little amount of time. It's hard to be a parent that's really involved with your child if it's only every other weekend. And so shared parenting means that both parents are involved to a high degree with the child. And there are different ways to do that. One way is a week at a time. In other words, the child is with the mother for a week, and after that, the child is with the father for a week, and that alternation continues. It doesn't have to be exactly that. That's 50-50. Sometimes it's maybe 60-40% with the two parents. But the basic idea is that the child spends a lot of time with each parent. And there's been research on that, trying to compare the outcomes. How do children do under shared parenting compared to traditional single, one parent having primary custody of the child? And most of those studies, there have been a number of them. If you add all those studies together, the overall impression is that children do better with shared parenting. So we're hoping that will increase in different states and even in different countries. Let me mention something, though, about the idea of prevention. And I don't want to throw a wet blanket on this altogether, but I do want to point out that I don't see how parental alienation is ever going to be totally 100% prevented. And why is that? Because where does it come from? It typically comes because one of the parents is convinced that he or she is the best parent and the only parent for that child. And parents who have that attitude, sometimes it's described as having a personality disorder. For instance, where you feel that you're the best parent in the world and nobody else can possibly match you. So those people with personality disorders are still going to be around, and they're still going to have that idea, and they're still going to try to get back at the other parent by manipulating the child. So I can see how parental alienation can be reduced a lot, but I guess I'm dubious that it would ever be totally prevented. So I don't want you to get discouraged, because I think there's a lot of work to be done, and a lot can be accomplished. It's a little bit like child abuse, physical and sexual child abuse. I mean, that's been studied for 50 or 60 years, and all sorts of programs and campaigns and intervention models are in place to prevent and reduce child abuse. But it still happens, because the problem is there are a small number of parents who aren't very good parents and whose own personality issues interfere and compromise their parenting. And so they're still around, and they still engage in child abuse. And so it still has to be recognized. It's kind of the same thing, that the idea with child abuse, it's great if it could be recognized sooner rather than later, while it's still mild and not more severe. And we had the same argument with regard to parental alienation, for it to be recognized sooner rather than later.
On the questions that come up about when prevention doesn't work, early intervention doesn't work, the mediation is weaponized or refused, or, the clause with a lot of the mediations is that if they don't both fully agree, then none of them mediated. Even if they get 99% mediated, if one part isn't agreed, then it's a wash. Some of the early intervention protections, protections from child prevention, child protection, domestic violence, guardian ad litems. When you see or have done conferences on severe cases of alienation, when those have, been not stopped, and so a case is escalated to the point it's got severe severed contact, severe falsified allegations, even when they may know who and why the case got to that point. Have you seen any cases where they're repairable without the diagnosis, without the mental health component? In other words, you might have an alienator that is criminally stopped because the alienation goes to forms of crimes, and maybe they're incarcerated. But have you had studies where, I'm going to give you an example. Our agency serves about 300 children and families in any given week, and we started in-home about 25 years ago. And our in-home model focuses on the parents. And just like you said, with early intervention, when they're contacting about behavior problems or marital problems or parenting problems, we really focus on getting the parents together first and finding out where the discord is and aligning it, and finding out where their values or abuse may be influencing their marriage or their parenting innocently. And we've had a lot of success. And I fell in love with that model. And I was trained on that model by the very same states that aren't using that model once it becomes a severe case of alienation. And so are there really more, like you said, you don't want to throw a wet blanket on it, that we're always going to have cases of abuse and alienation, but it just seems that there's rampant abuse and extremely little prevention. And I guess I want to ask why, because we all know in working with mentally ill or mental illness or wanting to make a difference for areas that are impacting health and well-being of children and families, I think we all understand you're going to see problems with dental or physical, or areas that have maybe poverty might have more obesity. But I'm curious, at a leadership level where you've done so much incredible work over decades, why isn't there more leadership at prevention when these cases get so severe so that they could be treatable?
Well, first of all, I think the approach that you're describing, as I understand it, I think it makes a lot of sense. In other words, you emphasize going into the home and working with both parents, and that I'm sure that you have some kind of interaction with the children too, but that your primary focus is on helping the parents change what they do. You want the alienating parent to cut out what he or she is doing, and you want the rejected parent to be as supportive as possible to the children during this difficult time. Now, I'm sure I just summarized that in one sentence, so I'm sure it's more complicated than that. But that is a really important concept. And other people have talked about the treatment of moderate and maybe some severe cases, which is like that, where they focus on coaching the mom and coaching the dad. By coaching, I mean, it's pretty instructive. It's not, you don't too much go in and say, how do you feel? It's more like, this is what we're going to do this week, and this is how we think you should handle these problems. And to some extent, you try to figure out what the underlying feelings might be, but you're really trying to get people to change their behavior. But my point is that this approach works in many cases if both parents participate. There, as far as I can see, and what I've read, is that sometimes one of the parents simply won't participate, or if that person does participate, that it's not in a good way, and they undermine the progress that's being made between the child and the other parent. So I think those are the really severe cases. And in other words, I think we have the same definition of severe. I mean, severe means that the child is not going to see the parent B at all, and maybe that has been in place for months or even a year or so. Or if the child does go see parent B, the child is impossible during the entire parenting time. The child doesn't participate, the child stays in their room, the child gets on the telephone with the alienating parent, and so on. So those are different ways to have severe, but severe also means that the alienating parent is engaging in a very high level of alienating behaviors and typically has almost no insight into what they are doing. In their mind, what they're doing makes sense. So some of these people, I think you can help by being clear about what your expectations are and working with them and being patient with them and sort of trying to understand their point of view. But in the end, they have to make changes in the way they're managing the children. So I guess I'm saying is I think your approach sounds really neat and it must be helpful to many, many people. But I imagine that there are a few people who simply don't tune in and who don't accept the suggestions or the coaching that's being provided. And those are the really severe cases. And for those, I think you have to do something else.
In the cases that are really severe, have you found what I've started to explore in research is if the behaviors can't be stopped that are abusive, the therapy for the trauma is not able to launch. In other words, if a bully was still attacking, this notion that we would put the victims in therapy when they're still, under a hypervigilant, paradigm of defense or PTSD or abuse or trauma, one of the areas that we're seeing that's seeming to have a negative impact on the healing of the two parents is a promotion of litigation or a promotion of manipulating the therapy for the outcome of maybe being able to get unilateral control of the kids. So actually using the therapy, the tools, we've had more and more calls this last 3 years of parents completely lying about why they're coming to therapy, completely lying about the court orders, manipulating the information to the therapist. So do you have feedback for challenging the larger system that is profiting off of alienation? And do you feel like
that you're describing that are very severe, that the children have been severely affected in their rejection, that the parent who's the alienating parent is unstoppable, that he or she refuses to do anything and has no insight? We consider that those children are being abused, that they're being abused by the alienating parent. And we recommend that they be removed from that household. I don't see what else you can do. That if the parent is not going to stop doing what they're doing and has no insight or no interest in stopping, I think the children have to be removed from the care of that parent. And where do they go? Typically, they go with the parent that previously was rejected. And then you hope, you work with everybody and you hope that gradually the children can go back and have some time with the parent that previously was the alienating parent. But I think it depends on what happens in their counseling.
Have you seen cases where a severe alienator was able to get treatment after accountability, consequences, boundaries, where they were able to receive treatment and kind of engage empathy in some of the behaviors that would have prevented, engage compromise, engage support for the other parent, value shared parenting? I have not seen that in all of my work and over 2 decades of working. There is that extreme level of abuse. And I just haven't seen a lot of cases where the abuser, outside of severe incarceration or things that took them out of that environment and let them heal for a long time. But a lot of them seem like the multi-generational trauma that even the alienator has is not being addressed or healed. And
I think you're right. I think people get stuck. And the child is removed from that person and placed with the previously rejected parent, and they usually do fine. In their new household, they might need some coaching or some counseling, but that usually works out okay. The alienating parent may or may not come around. And sometimes the strategy I've heard about is you you point out that it's simply in their self-interest to behave in a certain way. It's in their self-interest if they want to see their child again, to be supportive of the child's relationship with parent B, is who I've been calling it. And people sometimes suggest play acting. You say to the person, we know you don't believe this. You know that you don't feel like this is the right thing, but let's try pretending. Let's see if you can pretend to be supportive of the child's relationship with the other parent. And I realize it sounds almost silly, I suppose, but I think sometimes people can try to pretend, and then maybe after a while they do that, they find that it works, and they get more of what they ultimately want. But I think what you're saying, Lily, is you're right, that really, really severe cases, the child typically gets moved to the parent that was previously rejected, and it is really, really hard to help the child re-engage with the alienating parent, because that person usually does not want to make any changes.
Well, I think that there has to be an incentive, and unfortunately, the system seems like by the time the case is so severe that the incentives and reinforcement have really been for alienating behaviors. That if you falsify a document, you may get unilateral custody with no custody evaluation, no attorneys. If you withhold a child and don't let the child go, if you manipulate the circumstance so the child believes that they were abandoned, all of these things in a custody case almost seem like you're winning the lotto. And that's the question I have for you of, do you think that the larger system is influencing some of these outcomes that could be treated or preventable, but there is almost a collective trauma or abuse paradigm that it's normal or okay to have kids never see a parent again because the court decided, or it's okay because the guardian ad litem wasn't educated in parental alienation?
I think in those cases, it's not the court's fault. I think some parents are so determined in their own way of thinking, and it's not the result of the litigation or the guardian ad litem, the judge or the therapist, is that some people are just absolutely stuck in being convinced that they're right and everybody else is wrong. And that's a result of human nature, is that some people have personality traits or personality disorders that maybe they're antisocial. They do things that are against the law, and it doesn't matter to them. Some people are extremely narcissistic, and some of these people are not fixable. And you have to protect the child from that. You have to remove the child from that home. And maybe at some later point, maybe the parent will come around and have some contact with the child.
Before we talk about your work with the DSM and how professionals and agencies can support your work, how we can spread outreach about how that would make a difference, and having it have a diagnosis and treatment interventions, and having it be maybe embraced even as a treatable problem, not a horrific nightmare or, a death sentence, or so many people, the trauma that just even starting to embark on a court case can take upon their lives, to shift it to, this could be, exciting to look at your family history and maybe multi-generational trauma, and to overcome it as a family and prevent it for future generations. I'm really excited about your work with the DSM, and I want to give you time to talk about that. And just before I do that, the one area on prevention that bleeds over into the DSM is if it is a severe case and all of those things have been tried, and you're dealing with maybe more of a severe sociopathic anti-personal or antisocial personality disorder, do you believe, or have you had success in models that do seek criminal charges? And we're seeing that there's different groups that are supporting criminal court to stop custodial interference, slander, child abductions when a child is taken to another country or state. And we're starting to see some success on parents learning and being advocated and shown how to stand up for themselves as victims of crimes, and that it's not helping treat the family law issues, but it's at least helping stop the abuse so that the issues could be treated And I just want to ask if you could kind of include that with your DSM discussion. Is it necessary to be able to successfully treat with this DSM protocol to have the abuse stopped? Is it necessary, or can you still treat the trauma with the DSM?
Let me try to talk about that first, about the imposing, I guess, criminal sanctions, criminal trials on people who violate laws regarding undermining the child's relationship with the other person. It's my understanding that almost every state has some sort of law to that effect, but they're usually not enforced. Usually nobody does anything. If you go to the local sheriff, he says, "Oh, I can't do anything about what that mom or dad is doing, and I'm certainly not going to arrest that mom and dad." But I have heard that there's been some success with that. Now, I've had some personal experience in a few cases where the judge put the alienating parent in jail, not under a criminal charge, but under contempt of court. That if a parent violates the court orders over and over again, that the judge can invoke contempt of court and can put the person in jail for a period of time. In fact, the longest one I saw, the judge counted up how many times the mother prevented the child from going to see the dad on his parenting time. And I forget the exact number. It was like 70 or 80 times. And the judge said, "Now, ma'am, you might not know this, but every single incident is punishable by being in jail." And I think the judge said 5 days. And the judge said, "So 70 times 5 days, you can be in jail until your child turns 18. But he said, "But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to reduce it to a certain amount." And I forget the exact number, but the judge put the mother in jail for 3 or 4 months. And that was one way. Did it work? I don't think so. As far as I can tell, the mother continued as best she could to undermine the child's relationship with the dad. And the same thing happened with this other case where the dad was the alienating parent, and the dad had a career and was a professional and didn't want to go to jail during the week. So the judge calculated out weekends, and the dad went to jail for a series of weekends to serve his time. I don't think that helped. I think it seemed like the right thing to do, but I don't think it convinced the dad to change what he was doing. So I'm a little bit dubious as to fixing parents who have really, really severe personality disorders. Now, what you suggested was not just jail, but actually going to prison for a period of time, maybe 6 months or a year or whatever. Maybe in that case, maybe they have long enough to think about it that when they get out, they might do things differently. But I guess this is sort of consistent with my idea that I don't think that this is ever going to be totally solved, just because nothing in life is totally solved. You know, whether it's depression or schizophrenia or child abuse. I mean, there's always going to be a residual mental health issue that's going to affect some people. You asked me about DSM, and I think we've been trying to deal with that for several months. And, we have submitted proposals to it's called the DSM Steering Committee, which is the committee at the American Psychiatric Association that deals with these proposals. And we've gotten some feedback that there are certain things they didn't like about the first proposal, so we sent in another one with some modifications. But we're really hopeful. It's kind of hard to tell what's going to happen for sure, but we're really hopeful that the words parental alienation will be in the DSM-5. Now it's actually called the DSM-5 TR. The TR stands for text revision. So it's the same DSM that's been around since the year, whatever that was, 2013, I guess. but it's been revised, and so it's called a text revision. So why does that matter? I think the main reason why it matters is if those words are in the DSM, that the concept of parental alienation and parental alienation theory will be taught to trainees in family counseling, mental health, psychology, and law. And that's our hope, that it'll trigger more attention to those topics in academic courses. And so what? Well, the result, we hope, would be the recognition of parental alienation sooner rather than later in individual cases. In other words, that when the case is mild, it will be recognized either by a psychologist or a judge, and an intervention will take place. So that's the main reason why we want it to be in the DSM, is that it will be recognized and taught. I'll tell you another sort of practical reason is, nowadays there's all this arguing goes on. When the topic comes up in court, there's all this arguing between one attorney and the other attorney and this expert and that expert as to whether or not parental alienation really exists. And if it's in the DSM, I think that much of that arguing will go away, and there'll still be disagreements, but the arguing won't be over the reality of parental alienation. There might be arguing over whether or not parental alienation is happening in this family, you know, and you'd have to look at the data, you have to look at the testimony, the evidence, and so on to try to figure that out. But I think it would reduce, to some extent, the arguing that happens in courts every day.
What I would think that would still happen, but I would hope it would reduce it. But in some of the cases I've been on where there's overwhelming evidence, or the court order is even broken in court, in trial, and I haven't seen them stop. So that's why I ask a little bit more about the system. But maybe, like you're saying, if the system had an academic evidence-based definition, that the system could refer to that instead of maybe turning a blind eye or not giving credence. And at least that would be an intervention. But even with some of these things, I'm seeing dead ends that are ending in kind of catastrophic ways. But I want our agency to support what you're doing. If you could share how other agencies, professionals can get on board with your petition and support that, how can we do that?
Well, with regard specifically to the DSM, probably, I mean, it's the proposal is under consideration now, but there may come a time in 2 or 3 months, if they post it for public comment, that if the American Psychiatric Association wants to make a significant change in the DSM, a lot of time they post the information for public comment, and at which point they get hundreds and thousands of messages, and they're all collected. You know, there's an online system where you go on, you log in. You can be anybody. You don't have to be a professional to give public comment. You can be anybody, and lots of people. We hope a lot of people will do that. We've already gotten a huge amount of professional support and family support for the proposal. In other words, when we first submitted it, we asked people if they wanted to endorse it, and we got almost 2,000 people to endorse the proposal that we submitted to the American Psychiatric Association. Some of those were parents or grandparents, some of them were mental health people, some of them were legal professionals, some of them were research people, and so that level of support we were very gratified by. But this may cycle through again. In other words, the APA itself might invite comment. And so when that happens, I hope that you can get the word out to people in your network to send in your opinions in favor of the proposal.
Well, we're so grateful for all of the work that you do. You have made such a difference for so many families and professionals. I don't know if you're aware of that, but I did want to ask in closing 2 questions. And one is, with one is going to be kind of about for professionals and one is for parents, and kind of your message of hope, your message of perseverance, your message for the movement. But I've got, articles like this one that, that are just stacks that I have, and I'm sure other professionals do too, articles of already evidence-based screeners, tools, assessment tools, intervention tools. And Gardner's goes back to 1985, and he was referring cases that he had witnessed in 1957. And I just want to know, for professionals that are like me, that don't want to give up, we know that we can overcome it, to the extent of the wet blanket, but how to inspire professionals to not give up when these cases seem unsurmountable, or when it feels hopeless, or the families are so desperate that they're attacking, almost like a drowning victim. They're attacking even people trying to help them. What message would you give for professionals who really want to try to help eradicate, to the best of our ability, parental alienation in the United States?
I think the first step for professionals is to tune in and learn about this topic. It is surprising that some social workers, psychologists, somehow this has gone right past them. They're not aware of it. And occasionally you hear anecdotes of a psychologist who's a clinical psychologist discovering that she herself is a victim of parental alienation, and she reads up on it, and she had never learned about it in her training in graduate school or during her practice. And suddenly she's discovering that she is in the middle of this condition, and she goes and she learns about it, and it dawns on her that people in her field need to learn about this. So that's the first step for professionals, is read up on it, go to conferences, join organizations that help you learn about parental alienation. I promote my own organization, which is called PASG, Parental Alienation Study Group. And the website is www.pasg.info. You can tune in there and send a message that you want more information or you want to join. So I think for professionals, really, and they also need to have an open mind, since I'm not really totally sure why, but a lot of professionals have this idea that there's something wrong with parental alienation theory, that it's in an extreme case, they say it's a hoax, or it was fabricated by Richard Gardner or by somebody else. And so I hope that those psychologists and psychiatrists and other people, I hope they learn how to have an open mind and listen to some of these stories that are told, because the stories told by parents and grandparents are very, very convincing. I mean, there are many books written by parents and grandparents about this, and children and adult children about this. So anyway, that's my suggestion for professionals, is learn about it. And if you have a case, ask for help. If you're totally befuddled by what's happening, get a consultation with somebody. But that's what I think the professionals should be doing. I guess you asked me about the affected family members. I guess it would be good for them to study up on this too, but that's probably not the main thing they need to do. It's very, very painful to be a victim of parental alienation and to be a targeted or an alienated parent. And so those people, my main advice is don't do it by yourself. Get help and get a team surrounding you of friends, other professionals, maybe a therapist, some family members, and people who really believe in you. So
I want to welcome you back to our interview with Dr. Bernet, and we're finalizing the interview on this question that is probably the most important, which is about what you would recommend for parents that are currently going through a severe alienation case. What message of hope for resilience of the human spirit, that they can heal themselves or find empowerment or help others. But what would you give parents who are in one of the more extreme cases?
Lily, I think that's a really good point, and I guess I have a couple of suggestions for alienated parents or grandparents. One is please don't try to do this by yourself. That you really need to have a team around you, and by a team, I don't necessarily mean a team of professionals and attorneys and accountants. I mean friends and relatives that you can count on to be supportive. And I'm sure that somewhere in your orbit you can have people like this, whether a sibling in your own family or another relative or people you know or your neighbors. Or I think you really need to have people that you can call, especially at moments that really seem desperate and unhappy. So I think that's a really important point, is to be part of, to get your own network together in whatever way you can. And also, as Lily mentioned, I think there is opportunities to be hopeful for several reasons. One is that sometimes kids come around. Sometimes later in life, after a year or so, sometimes after they move out of their home where they're being living with the alienating parent, and for instance, they go away to college, or they get involved in a serious relationship with somebody, and they get distance from that parent, and they start to ask themselves, what happened, or where is my mom, my dad, whoever is missing. Because their significant other will ask them that question. If they have a girlfriend, the girlfriend will say, well, whatever happened to your dad? You never mentioned him. And occasionally that pops something in the person who's been alienated, and say, gee, I guess I better find out what's going on with that person that I've been missing. In terms of being hopeful, it's generally suggested to try and do what you can to stay in touch. And, that usually takes the form of sending a card, a birthday card or Christmas card, maybe graduation card or whatever, that's pleasant and simply says, we're thinking about you. And, we hope you're doing okay, something like that. You shouldn't do that to the point of harassing the person. But I think that if you send something occasional, my own feeling is I think hard mail, real mail, is better than email for situations like this, because there's an actual object that has your name on it and your signature on it. So those are a couple of ideas of how to stay hopeful. But I know it's a tough situation, and I know it's a hard thing to get through. So we're wishing you the best, and I thank Lily for inviting me to be here today.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for all that you do. And I want you to know that the messages that all of you put out as heroes that are kind of spearheading the movement, Dr. Bennett, you matter. There's so many times that I've been in places with clients, and the interviews that you all are doing on the different social media platforms are a way for people to connect, to help. And it really is a lifeline. And so I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for the work that you do for victims. It's an honor.
Okay, it's nice to see you today.
Well,